Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU's live stream. Tonight, we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Catherine Day, who's a former Secretary General of the European Commission and the first woman to have held that post. Just to introduce the rest of us, my name is Fiona Wishlade, and also with us on the chat are Paul Miller and Bernd Poor. Paul's monitoring social media for questions that come through on Facebook. So please do send in questions if you have them. You can post them on Twitter or put them on Facebook, and Paul will watch out for them and feed them into the discussion. And Bernd is making sure that all the technology works for us and recording the session so it can go out later on our YouTube archive. Just a reminder that we're Glasgow Loves EU is a non-political organisation. We're part of the European movement in Scotland, which we would encourage you to join. And I know that Catherine's also on the board of the European movement in Ireland, the sister organisation. So, Catherine, you've had an extraordinary career in the European Commission, starting in the late 70s, and you've continued to do lots of interesting things also since you left that post in 2015. So there are lots of things that we could ask you about, but maybe I could kick off on the theme of European integration. And I mean, you joined the European Commission in 1979, and that was quite a quiet time in European integration in a sense, not long after Ireland, UK, and Denmark had joined. Can you tell us a bit about, what was the background to you wanting to join the European Commission? What motivated you to do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start by saying thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this evening. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to people in Scotland about at least my experience and views of the EU. I was studying economics and politics in university in the beginning of the 1970s. And actually, one of my tutors was a man called Garrett Fitzgerald, who was a passionately pro-European foreign minister and later Prime Minister of Ireland. So it was a very exciting time to be a student. I also loved languages, and I was studying in particular economic integration, different theories of it. So, and then coming from a small island on the western edge of Europe, I suppose I was excited to travel and interested in, seeing the wider world. So all those things went into the mix. And it was still very early. Ireland has always been a very strong supporter of the EU, and the referendum to join had huge yes number of voters. But even in 1979, people didn't really understand very much what it was about. And so it was a half a voyage of discovery. But and I certainly never expected to end up 35 years later as the Secretary General of the Commission. So it was a very, very exciting career opportunity for me. But I was going into largely the unknown, as with youthful enthusiasm one does.
And I mean, you had quite a range of portfolios that you worked on, from industry, competition, external affairs, and enlargement, and so on. But that kind of early period when you joined, was often sort of characterized as a kind of period of Eurosclerosis, I think was the term used at the time. I don't know whether you think that's fair, but what was it like then to be working in the Commission in what became kind of like a period of major change from completion of the internal market, the adoption of the euro, and the expansion of policy initiatives into an ever increasing range of areas.
Well, when Jacques Delors became president in 1985, I always still remember that it was a bit like an electric shock went through the administration, because you're right about the stagnation. People didn't have very high expectations. There were a lot of people who passionately believed in Europe but were getting frustrated, etc. And then came a new French president who was very clear what he wanted to achieve. And I think he was lucky as well in a number of the other commissioners who were appointed to his team. I was in the cabinet of Peter Sutherland then, who was a very young, brilliant competition commissioner. But Lord Cofield was also a very important member and responsible for the internal market. And then you had others like Henning Christopherson. So Delors had a magnetism, a charisma, a very clear idea of where he wanted to go, but he was also lucky in the people he had surrounding him. And for me, both, I suppose, looking back on it, I think I understand better than I did at the time because I was still a young official making my way up. I think what was so important about the internal market was um, they broke away from an endless process of trying to harmonize everything to coming to a belief that basically all of the member states wanted to protect their citizens, treat them well, and that it was time to move to a recognition of equivalent standards, that there were differences, but nobody was operating to very low standards of consumer protection or health and protection. So that move away from trying to harmonize everything. And I remember discussions where some of my British colleagues were very frustrated about having to kind of work out jam jar sizes of 454 grams because that was a pound. And so the pound of jam was suddenly going to look ridiculous when you went metric. So those kind of things that really irritated people and didn't actually change anything. It was the contents. And if the British wanted to have their jam in pound pots and were used to buying it that way, why did it have to be harmonized across Europe? So that was a real breakthrough moment. The other thing I think that stayed with me through my career was the European Commission doesn't do a lot of short-term things. Governments are better at dealing with, immediate problems in a member state. But the Commission is, I think, quite good at doing long-term strategies, 10, 20, 30-year strategies. So the internal market was one of those. The euro was another 20-year strategy. Enlargement. So all of the big things that have marked the European Union have been 20, 30-year strategies. And what the Commission does is to have a strategy, try to kind of map out the end destination. But then in 10 or 20 years, governments change everywhere, people come with different ideas. So it's to try and keep the target in mind, but to be adaptable in terms of how you get there. And you can see that now in the climate changes as well, in the Green Deal and other things that require a massive investment, a massive change in the way that we live and behave. And I think it's a very useful complementarity, which I wouldn't want to exaggerate, but I think the EU members have found it quite useful to have the European level there to help them figure out the long term while they have to deal on the ground with the more immediate problems. So it's not a clean cut division between the two. But I think again for the smaller countries, and all European countries are small now actually in the world context, it's very useful to have an executive that's coming up with proposals, that's willing to negotiate and compromise, and to gradually build a particularly European way towards reaching long-term goals. So the seeds of all that came from the Delors Commission, without a shadow of a doubt.
And one of the things that happened then was also sort of like a significant increase in the budgetary resources that were available, and it seems quite incredible looking back at how that was achieved. There's like the doubling of the amount that was allocated to the structural funds twice, I think, over successive budgetary periods, and then there's like the long-term planning process that you've talked about. It's one of the things we notice in the UK now that we no longer have the structural funds. We also essentially no longer have a regional policy to speak of.
I think that was part of taking this wider view, because you had Ireland joining in 73, but then you had Spain and Portugal coming in. So you had poorer countries joining. who could not, let's say, take the strains of where the internal market wanted to go without getting some assistance with financing for their growth so that they could catch up with the level of the others. And in the end, the structural funds became hugely important as a revenue transfer, but not just as a budget top up. It came with strings attached with the kind of policies that Europe wanted to promote. So there was, of course, a large element of infrastructure, but also a large element of investment in people. And I think, those are the kind of things that have really benefited across the whole EU. And I can imagine that it's difficult for regions in the UK that were used to receiving structural funds and are now not getting them. Also because not only for the money, but also because they came with that kind of wider world policy too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, thinking back, I mean, what would you characterize as the the sort of like the greatest sort of achievements in policy terms, and maybe what would you say the kind of like the limits were? Do you think that the EU ventured into areas where maybe it would have been better staying away, and are there gaps, are there things that should have been achieved or could still be achieved?
Big questions. um, I, I mean, I do, what I think is the most lasting value of the EU is that it has helped a group of small countries uh, come together and organize themselves, maybe expensively and in a complicated way, but organize themselves to at least have a role in shaping their own destiny. Because in the modern world, no European country has the clout on the world stage to be able to say, this is where we stand without teaming up with others. So I think, and I went through the horrible long nights of the Euro crisis when, prime ministers were on their own having to take huge decisions. Some of them knew that they would not win the next election, but they still had to take the decision to keep the euro alive because for the future of their country, they knew that their country had to stay in the EU and the EU had to succeed. So it's really when the chips are down that you realize how much a part of the domestic policy and the domestic prospects of each European Union country. The UK always sitting it out basically in those days, saying, we're not in the euro, we don't intend to join, we wish you well, but we're not in this. But every other country, I mean, the Greeks never thought about leaving the EU. They didn't think about leaving the euro either. They were desperate to hang on because they understood that it's the only place to be if you want to count in the modern world. So I think that is the biggest success of all. And I know it's extremely tedious. Believe me, I have lived through the most incredibly excruciatingly boring times, and when things don't advance and people are taking positions even actively against their own interests. But the miracle is that in the end of the day, it works. And I always used to say to international trading partners who would say, oh, why does it take you so long? Why can't we agree? It takes us a long time to agree because we want everybody on board. We want people to go home and implement whatever they have agreed to, not to kind of, say, oh, yes, that's all fine, and then go home and not do it. So the real strength is sometimes in taking a few extra months or making an extra compromise in order to get everybody on board. And then I think that's how big policies like internal market, like the euro, like enlargement have been possible because they take the stamina, but also the flexibility to get there. The limits, I think, the limits are obviously what the member states are willing to, where they're willing to pool their sovereignty and where they're not. And you usually only see that in times of crisis. I mean, look, health has always been an area where the EU has no competences, very little to say. But with COVID, suddenly it became essential that we had a common buying policy for the vaccines, and everybody could see that. So out of a crisis came the idea that, okay, we have to do certain things in health. And out of the Ukraine crisis now, but also I think the worry of Donald Trump returning and not being a fully signed up member of NATO, particularly not of Article 5, Europe is finally having to grasp the difficult nettle of defence, which is going to involve major spending, but also a major transformation of how Europe does defence. So it's the member states have become over time increasingly reluctant to transfer more powers to the centre. But when something happens and they realise that they can't do it on their own, then they are quite pragmatic and say, okay, well, within certain limits, etc., let's do it that way. And I think Brussels has learned a lot as well. I mean, from the days of the £1 pot of jam, I think has also learned that it can't try to do everything and it can't try to please everybody. So it has also gradually concentrated itself in the areas where transnational working coordination makes sense and can be done. And it does a lot less little small irritating initiatives nowadays than it used to do 10, 20 years ago.
So it's more of the what was it, the big on big and small on small
Yeah,
approach to things. So I mean, maybe moving on to enlargement, that was another of the big dossiers that you worked on with this, like the in the pre-accession phase and the FAR program and all those kind of activities, the Europe agreements that prepared member states. I mean, I suppose we always tend to think of the sort of Central and Eastern European countries, but obviously Austria, Sweden, and Finland joined in the meantime, but which was easier to accommodate, I think, because of the nature of their economies. But I mean, the scale of what the Central and Eastern European countries in particular had to change was huge, and of course that also changed the EU, just not only in terms of the number of people, the number of languages, but also some of the I guess the philosophy of and traditions that they brought with them. What would be your reflections on the successes and the challenges of enlargement?
Well, I think you're right that every enlargement changes the EU. And if you're working in it, I mean, that's the exciting thing, is to see how can you do things that you wouldn't have thought were possible. So I always say that for me in my career, the most exciting and important thing I did was to work on the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, because it felt, it's not too much to say, it felt like righting the wrongs of history. Europe had been divided against its will, and finally there was an opportunity to bring it together. And those countries were just so keen. They constantly said, we'll do whatever it takes, just tell us what to do and we'll do it. And I think the successful part was the economic integration. That has gone very well. It has lifted the living standards right across Eastern Europe. It has integrated them into the wider world trading system and into the European system in particular. But what we completely underestimated with hindsight was how long it takes to change political cultures, how long it takes to change political systems. And because even in 2004, the EU was still largely an economic entity, or that was where the bulk of the work was. I think we put too much emphasis on that, and we didn't put enough emphasis on things like the legal system, the court system, and what you saw was kind of shadowy figures having been swept aside in popular revolutions, but then coming back out of the shadows, and a lot of corruption coming in some countries. Now, I'm an optimist by nature, and looking at Poland and Hungary, I have always felt that these were, what has happened were kind of aberrations, and that they would come back in the end to sharing the values of the EUs that they joined. And I think that has proven to be the case in Poland, because I think not only the young people, but a lot of people in those countries, they want what the European Union has to offer. They don't want the alternatives that they're being served up now. But it's not easy for them to get to grips with it, and they have to solve it themselves. And I dealt a lot with Bulgaria and Romania, and it was very interesting to see at certain stages when the Romanians looked like they were going very heavily backwards, people just went out on the street and they said, this is not the kind of country we want to live in. We want the prosperity, but we also want the freedom where the state is not our enemy, where the state works for us and is our servant. And where we have faith in the legal system if we have to take cases, etc., etc. So I think all of that, those are long-term changes that maybe we are always too impatient. We want everything done nice and neat and tidy in a couple of years. But actually, it takes a very long time to change the culture of a country. I mean, looking at the Ireland that I left in the late 1970s, it was, a poor, small, underdeveloped, and it's taken 50 years to get to the model of prosperity and reasonably socially liberal democracy that we have now. So we shouldn't expect it to go faster in the case of other countries. But and those countries also have to bring their particular contribution to bear in shaping the EU of the future. Now, I think the EU is going to be heavily absorbed with enlargement for the next 10 or 20 years. And will be bringing in poorer countries, which are a challenge because that will require more finance. But I think the EU has a good track record in terms of helping poorer countries integrate and become more prosperous. But this time we will learn the lesson. And if you look at Ukraine, if you will have a country that's divided with part of its territory occupied by Russia, that throws up all kinds of different problems. I mean, Ireland with our border has been difficult in the last few years, as everybody knows. Cyprus with its divided island. So the EU is not very keen to have to import, let's say, border disputes inside the EU as part of its membership. And I think, just a challenge of trying to integrate a country the size of Ukraine will be bigger than it has been in the past. But I am absolutely confident that these are the kind of problems that there's a lot of talented people around who can do it. But it will take sustained political will from successive governments as well to make it happen.
And you've spoken before about your pride in the EU being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, for the successful struggle for peace, reconciliation, democracy, and human rights. And I mean, just going back to what you were just saying, I mean, does that imply that, say, that the process of accession should have been sort of had more stringent criteria, that there should have been, I don't know, the chapters in the in the acquis should have been enforced more, and the process should have been longer? Or, I mean, thinking about the situation in Hungary and Poland as it was, that they looked like countries that weren't meeting the Copenhagen criteria for accession.
Well, this is partly a technocratic process and it's partly a political process. And you get to a stage in negotiations, it seems, that when everybody is fed up and just says, oh, let's get on with it and do it. And also, I think there's a concern about countries having reform fatigue if they don't, make it to the final hurdle. I think that's actually dangerous, but I think that's how the member state politicians see it. So there was certainly a desire to have a big bang enlargement then, and to bring in some who were not as ready as others. So you had Bulgaria and Romania joining 3 years later. You had Croatia then got caught up in a kind of ex post realization that what have we done, and had to wait until 2013, I think. So I think we have to learn lessons from all of this. Now, having said that, I think that there are times in life when you have to make a political leap, and that's for the prime ministers to decide. And the kind of problems that you have can be solved afterwards as well. But what doesn't work is if they want to make the great leap ahead and say, okay, sort it out afterwards, but they don't give you the resources to do it. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So I think the EU has learned a lot. There is something about the eternal optimism of the institutions in Brussels who always think the member states are going to behave. And why do I say that? I say in the Treaty of Rome, you had the procedure of taking infringement proceedings against member states. And in the beginning, if any member state got a letter from the Commission saying you're breaking the law, this is not correct, they would immediately say, oh my God, we have to correct it immediately. Then gradually they got more brazen, and you got to the stage where you had to take member states to court, which was terrible. And then you had to take them to court a second time, and then you had to fine them. And Article 7, which says that you can take away the voting rights of a member state that goes off the rails and doesn't adhere to the values, that was supposed to be the nuclear deterrent. But nobody could ever imagine that two member states would go off the rails and support each other and thereby negate the provisions of the article. I personally think the European institutions should have taken action sooner and been tougher with Poland and Hungary. But that was not what the prime ministers wanted. They wanted to give more time. Now they've eventually lost patience. And as I say, Poland has also, let's say, come back to the mainstream of wanting to abide by the Copenhagen criteria. So we'll see what happens next. But there's something wrong when every new treaty has to put in even more stringent requirements on the member states to actually live up to what they're signing up to. We have to have an adult conversation about that at some stage too.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we move on to talk about Brexit, Paul, is there anything coming from social media that you want to pick up on?
Just picking up on that point about populism and the kind of ongoing conflict between populist enterprises and the EU's response. What's your kind of expectation in the near term as to how that's going to play out in terms of upcoming elections? And do you think that what's your opinion of the kind of current EU strategy with that?
I think by its nature, the EU is fairly centrist, because there's no one leader, which is a good thing in my view, because then you don't have either one particular ideology or one particular personality dominating. And they have to find a middle ground of compromise in order to advance. So that makes it slower to decide, which can be frustrating internally and for partners. But I think it is actually a kind of safety valve. So I think when you look at across all of the countries, yes, there are right-wing movements in quite a few countries, but some of them are successful in the polls. Some are less successful than the opinion polls would actually make you think. I think we just have to wait and see. I think there will be probably more far right people in the next European Parliament. But exactly how many and from which countries, that we'll have to wait and see. But I do, having been there for so long, I do see as well that people can campaign in a harder way, that when they come into government, the complexity of the decisions they have to take and the fact that they need others to help them to achieve their objectives, that does tend again to push people towards the centre. So I'm not trying to say that it's not good. It's a particularly important election, and I'm quite worried about in some countries about what kind of politics will it result in. But I do think that there is that tendency to kind of draw people towards the centre as being the only place where they can actually operate and function. So I'm pinning my hopes on that.
Yeah, well, it's always good to hear an optimistic outlook in the current climate. Just picking up on the Brexit issue. I mean, here in the UK, we've ended up really pretty much with the hardest possible Brexit on Michel Barnier's famous steps, and that was on the back of an advisory referendum, but which also didn't say what leave actually meant. I mean, sometimes we were being assured we would stay in the single market and nothing much would change. And there's been some discussion about whether having a citizens' assembly could have been a good way to have address the issue of how the UK responded to the referendum result, and that's something that Ireland's got quite a lot of experience with. And I know that you've recently chaired the Assembly on gender equality, and I wonder if what are your thoughts on how and how well this process works, and whether it's something that could have delivered benefits on a complex question like how to Brexit.
Having been through one myself, I'm a big fan of citizens' assemblies, because what they do is they give people the time to get information, to debate and change their ideas, and then come out with recommendations to government. And they are only recommendations. Where I think they have been particularly successful in Ireland has been on difficult social issues like marriage equality and like abortion, where the politicians didn't know how to read public opinion. And as it turned out, we're quite far behind public opinion. So I think that process of providing information and time and space to not just rush to an immediate knee-jerk reaction to a question, but to actually tease it out with people on an informed basis, I think that's very good. Now, we've just had a failed referendum last Friday on two questions which came out. Not part of the problem, I think, is the government didn't follow what the citizens recommended. So if you like, again, they didn't read the citizens right, but there were a lot of other complications as well there. So it's not a failed safe model, let's say. But I do think however you do it, you need to find a way on something as complex as the EU. And this goes for all the existing member states as well. I think they really need to do more to explain and to, demystify the EU, to explain what it's all about. And then if you do have a referendum, but also if you're making a big policy change, you absolutely need full and informed commitment and engagement from the political level. And very often in all of the European countries, the politicians are a bit shy or feel uncomfortable having to kind of explain things that they know or that they're going to agree with and that are good for their country, but that, they know they will get some brickbats as well. And I think we have to get over that. If the EU is as important as they all know it is, then they've got to have the courage of their convictions and be prepared to tackle the difficult issues and explain to people. And I mean, what I found in the Citizens' Assembly was when people had the information and when they heard other views, they were prepared to be quite reasonable. They would say they would understand if something was going to take 5 or 10 years to happen, but they wanted it to start now. They didn't want it to stay in the ether because it was difficult. So I think we have to have a bit more trust in our citizens. But not just trust, but to give them the information and then be prepared to debate. So something, whether it's a Citizens' Assembly or something else, but I think that is a need inside the EU. We used to always say you can't kind of, be negative about the EU from Monday to Saturday and then expect people to go out and vote on Sunday in favour. You have to give them reasons to support it. And unfortunately, I do think Brexit has been, if you like, the biggest recruiting sergeant for the EU, because every European country now has seen what you can lose if you don't have it. But that's a kind of negative lesson, if you like. And I would like, for them to step up to the plate more on the positive messages, because all ministers and MEPs have got to make a decision. Do they support something or do they not support it? So they have to have gone through a reasoning process. Why not share their reasoning and also come clean with people and say, look, it's not perfect. We would have liked something that was closer to our system, but it's much more important to get the whole of Europe moving on this. And that's why we made a compromise and defend the decisions that they're actually taking.
Yeah. Okay, Paul, do you have anything that you want to chip in?
Well, I was just going to ask, obviously we're obsessed about, because of Brexit, our relationship with the EU and how that may develop in the future. But we're also interested in what do you think has been the effect of Brexit on Ireland's relationship with the EU?
It's been very difficult. I think it has proved to us again that we have made the right decision to stay in. But as you know, the closest neighbour, as the country that we think we know best, where we share English as a language, etc., that loss of closeness has been very, very difficult. And even on Anglo-Irish relations, where it was so easy for the prime ministers when they were in Brussels, or every minister would be in and out of Brussels to meet their opposite number and to discuss not just the British-Irish issues, but in the broader context of supporting each other on, votes or policy discussions or whatever. So that loss is gone. I think Ireland and the whole EU has lost a lot of the British expertise, because the UK could be a pain in the neck about asking complicated questions about, well, exactly how will it work and what will it cost and where will it, why will it happen on this day? But it made everybody think about the consequences of the proposals before they implemented them. And I think with the huge technical expertise that the UK has in so many areas, that is a significant loss for the EU. So I do think that the EU very much wants a closer relationship with the UK. And I think we will be able to build it in the coming years. It can't be an kind of membership light, but I think that because of history and geography and politics, I think that we will have to find a better way of working together. And if you think about the big issues now, like defence, which is something that's a big concern for the UK and for the EU, that's an obvious area where we could cooperate more closely together. Also on trade, where it was the first time in my life I had seen the EU prepared to give more to the partner it was negotiating with than the partner wanted. So there's obviously room to build closer relationships there. It's wonderful that the UK has come back into Horizon Europe, again, bringing all that scientific expertise and research capacity, from which it will benefit, but also other European countries will benefit. So I can see lots of areas where we could have a closer relationship. And if we go step by step on that, we don't have to decide that there is any end destination. It just makes sense for countries that are close to each other and largely share the same values and are subject to the same pressures and the same problems, that we would work more closely together.
I mean, that crosses over really with what was going to be my last question, because now we have, I mean, I have the impression, in spite of what you say, that the EU has moved on from Brexit in a way that the UK hasn't really. Mm-hmm. It's still extremely divisive in our politics. Our two main political parties don't want to discuss it, in spite of the gaping hole it's left in public finances, and in spite of the day-to-day difficulties that many businesses face. And there's now a clear and fairly stable majority who would vote to rejoin the EU. So that's not just people who think it's a mistake, but we can't fix it, but people who would actively vote to rejoin. Now, I mean, obviously, it takes much more than for the UK to change its mind. What would it need on the EU side, or is it a question of picking the things that we can cooperate on, choosing areas where there's something that the UK can bring to the table, and working on a sort of like a fairly piecemeal case by case basis?
Well, as I said, I really do believe that the EU is open to having a closer relationship, to be defined, between it and the UK. I have to say, in all honesty, I don't think rejoining is an issue at all on the EU side. I think it's simply, if the UK said tomorrow, we want to come back, I don't think the EU would be jumping for joy, because I don't think that there has been a change of approach in the UK. Maybe it's too soon, maybe it'll never happen. But I mentioned earlier that all the current members of the EU know and believe that their country has to stay in the EU for the future, that it's a vital part of who they are in the modern world. I don't think that is the prevailing majority view in the UK, as far as I can see from the media and from talking to people. But I don't think it matters. I think, and in a way, it's a kind of something that came up often when the UK was a member. The UK always wanted to know, well, what's the destination? Whereas all the others were happy to get on the train and say, well, we're going along together and we'll see where the next station is, and maybe there'll be one after that. So I think, you know, until the UK has this kind of, which it may never have, kind of conversion to seeing itself as a small country, small European country, who has to have the bigger surroundings of the EU in order for itself to prosper and to matter in the world, I don't think the EU will open the door again. But that's a time scenario that can be very long. But I'm equally sure that the EU will want to have closer relations with the UK. And maybe we have to learn about each other again, you know, because Britain has been changed by Brexit too. Maybe closer working together over a long term will persuade the UK, okay, this is fine, this is as far as we want to go. Or maybe it will persuade another generation that, you know, actually we'd rather be inside because this is where we have to be, this is our natural place. But I don't think we have to ask those questions. I can understand why people, especially people who never wanted to leave, would feel, oh, please, you know, welcome us back with open arms. But I think having left, and I don't think that the UK fully understands the hurt and the kind of trauma that it caused on the EU side, you know, because you were so busy being consumed with your own hurt and trauma. But, you know, from even what it did to the groupings in the European Parliament, life has become easier in some ways without the UK. So, you know, there'll be all kinds of reasons why the EU would be very wary, but that doesn't mean that we can't have much closer relations. And either in the end it will work itself out, or maybe it won't matter much in the end, you know. So
yeah, I mean, the kind of
on the next 10
years
lending, rather than
yeah, I mean, the kind of lending there was under the next generation EU package, it was difficult to imagine could have been pulled together so quickly if the UK had still been a member at that, you know, at that point. And yeah,
also being part of the euro is now a condition of membership. So and that would be another big one to swallow, I think. But
yes, yeah,
let's see, you know, let's not close off any avenues or you know, nail our colors too firmly to any particular mast, because I think the important thing is that we find ways back to each other. We you know, for all the angst, we did work extremely well together. Could we not pick up some of that again and work well together while respecting the different decisions that there have been?
Listen, it's great to end on an optimistic note, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time and knowledge and expertise. It's been really fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.